We function in automatic, and we are dancing mechanic. We are the robots. We are the robots.
In the last video I told you about the Macy Foundation conferences and about the Ratio Club in Britain and how the cyberneticists in those two groups came to see the mind as really a goal-oriented system, and the science of mind became the science of signals. Now, in order to control a mind, the mind doing the controlling has to have a bigger variety, to use the cybernetic term, than the mind being controlled. That means that the controlling mind has to have a greater variety of states than the mind being controlled. The mind being controlled has to be more limited, more predictable, more linear than the mind doing the controlling. So if everybody was transformed into a narrow-minded, goal-seeking, selfish individual, control was almost guaranteed. And the type of control that meant that the world was indecipherable, but the units, the atoms, you and me, became very predictable, became an art form in Russia under Vladislav Surkov.
Surkov is one of President Putin's advisors and has helped him maintain his power for 15 years. But he has done it in a very new way. Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He sponsored all kinds of groups, from neo-Nazi skinheads to liberal human rights groups. He even backed parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Surkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or fake.
The Washington Post new report out today. 1,100 lies and mistruths in October alone, an average of 30 a day. That's a land speed record of lying, people. Yeah. There's no one you know in your life that lies that much. And yet this is from the bully pulpit of the presidency.
See, the ultimate goal of all of this is the alien cortex's total control of life. It wants to make us into a psycho-civilized society, and then it'll go on to control nature. What geoengineering is really all about is subduing nature and making it psycho-civilized just like us.
Delgado's 1969 book, Physical Control of the Mind, Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society, spells out in graphic, controversial detail exactly what the aim of such technology ultimately is: behavior modification and control at a society-wide level.
There's this idea on the liberal left that progress is a kind of manifest destiny, that things will only get socially more liberal, socially better. There's this narrative that if you're not progressive, then you're on the wrong side of history, that history is evolving to be kinder, to be more liberal. I think there's this idea that there's social progress, that we got rid of slavery, we got civil rights, the women's vote, and all the way up until recently gay marriage. But you're ignoring the fact that those small token gestures of liberalism were bought at a very high price in totalitarianism. For example, Barack Obama, who liked the phrase on the wrong side of history, under Obama the Patriot Act was extended. And now the president has legal powers to murder American citizens abroad without judicial review. And the use of drones for targeted killings and assassinations was vastly increased. But what I've been trying to show in these past videos is that the alien cortex is unapologetically totalitarian. And as we get more modern, it implies that we get more alien cortex. So our destiny really is totalitarianism, in the form of right-wing totalitarianism, fascist totalitarianism, communist totalitarianism, and capitalist totalitarianism. With the Fed's control of the financial system and with its manipulation of markets, America is moving closer towards state capitalism, just like communist China. And it's also moving towards totalitarianism. What's just around the corner is a reduction in plenty. It's a reduction in resources, which implies more competition. And competition is what the alien cortex is all about.
For decades, riding in a taxi stayed the same miserable experience. But then Uber and Lyft came along and figured out a way to challenge the local taxi cab monopolies. Prices dropped, rides became easier to find, and quality went up. Way up. This is why competition is fundamentally important. Competition is the only force that consistently leads to lower prices and better quality goods and services, improving our daily lives.
How can a company lose $5.2 billion on $3.2 billion in revenue? Uber shows us how.
If you think the Uberization of our economy is something to be lauded, then the education system really did a great job in ensuring that you are a linear-thinking, narrow-minded individual that's perfect for exploitation.
We accept a state's prescription that's written in manuals. You do this first and this second and this third. They're set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands.
The great need of industry, as long as it's based on fossil fuel and machines that run best around the clock, is that people consume around the clock, that they convert their resources into consumption, and the credit system arises so that when they've exhausted their resources, they can mortgage their time. So the enemy of this is a life defined by values. A life defined by possessions or prestige is wonderfully predictable.
In our capitalist culture, we've been indoctrinated from a very early age to think of competition as something having quasi-mythico-religious aspects. We adore competition, we worship it, perhaps even more than the ancient Spartans did, and that's quite saying something. We've been taught to think of competition as a creative force, something that actually forced us to evolve to become the alien cortex that we are today. So we're supposed to worship competition as some kind of constructive force for good. But I must say I'm deeply, deeply skeptical. Whenever I see competition in play, I see basically an evolutionary suicide. If you go into the business section in, say, a library or an old-fashioned bookstore, the shelves are just about groaning with books on how to beat the competition. CEOs live and breathe the competition. But I think it's quite possible that they're completely nuts. Show me any CEO that lives and breathes the competition, and I'll show you somebody that has a bunch of crap products that the market doesn't want, and somebody else that has some better products that the market does want. I fail to see how that's competition, but it really is in the minds of CEOs. It has a quasi-sexual aspect as who's going to get the girl, as in who's going to get the customer. But I think really the girl's probably already decided before the match actually starts. And I think our emphasis on this idea that somehow the best emerges from competition is probably bogus. Working together, a pride of lions can bring down a buffalo. But if they start competing amongst themselves, don't be surprised if the buffalo just wanders off. So once the control freaks in the Macy Foundation and the Ratio Club had decided that the human mind was nothing but an alien cortex and the mind was just a goal-oriented machine, then naturally the definition of what competition is fell out of that. Competition is just when two goal-oriented machines have the same goal that can't be shared. So in other words, one's loss is the other's gain. It's basically a zero-sum game. Now you probably think of game theory and competition, zero-sum games as something to do with John Nash, probably because you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind, but it's actually John von Neumann from the Macy Foundation, somebody who worked with Alan Turing in Princeton, that the game theory actually comes from. Von Neumann was confined to a wheelchair, so some people have claimed that the wheelchair-bound mathematician was the inspiration for the character of Dr. Strangelove in Stanley Kubrick's 1963 film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. John von Neumann is the forgotten father of game theory. He came out with a paper on game theory in 1928 called A Theory of Parlor Games. An important part of the way von Neumann laid out game theory was the payoff matrix, which led to the famous Minimax theorem. Basically it means that if I get stuck in a zero-sum game against you, then we should both try to get the least worst outcome, and that's all Minimax is. Which leads to the important conclusion that there's a kind of optimum strategy for both of us, a kind of saddle point or equilibrium point. It's the point where the outcome sucks for both of us, but it's the best of the worst. So for example, in this payoff matrix, the number 6 is my least worst option. So if I take action 1, the worst that could happen is -5. If I took action 3, the worst that could happen is -3. Therefore, my best action is action 2, which gives me the least worst payoff, and that's 6. But correspondingly, for you, you should also take action alpha, which also yields 6, and that's why it's an equilibrium point. It's the least worst outcome for both of us. What's amazing is that so much of our capitalist system is predicated on zero-sum games, which means it sucks for everybody. It just means there's an outcome which settles out so that it sucks the least bad for everybody. Von Neumann's conclusion was that it's not worth playing two-player zero-sum games, and I must say I agree with him. That's why I'm anti-capitalist. But it also implies, for the same reasons, that von Neumann probably didn't like job interviews. The problem I feel with competition in my gut is that it's not worth fighting over contended scraps. It's especially not worth losing blood over. You're far better off using your time and resources to just go and find another scrap and not competing for one that's under contention. But our culture teaches us the exact opposite and even makes a virtue out of it. Now you may be wondering why, say, in the situation of, say, an aircraft gunner and a pilot, or a submariner trying to sink a merchant ship, why that doesn't resolve to a zero-sum game with a saddle point or equilibrium point. What's the difference between the two? Well, the first thing to notice that in a payoff matrix, it doesn't matter if one player understands or can predict the play of the second player. It makes no difference to the outcome. It doesn't matter if either of the players know the other player's move in advance. Now compare that to the situation of, say, an aircraft gunner and a pilot and a submarine or U-boat commander trying to sink a merchantman. Well, there it really does matter about predicting the move in advance. As I mentioned in the last video, a mixed strategy or a random strategy is absolutely crucial in those situations. It's absolutely crucial that they behave randomly and not predictably. But what's the difference? Well, the difference is, if you look at the payoff matrix, they each have infinite amounts of choice and play. In the case of a gunner and pilot, they have infinite latitude of choice, infinite variety, essentially. An important part of capitalism is that you get a range of choices, but they're limited and restricted. So, for example, to feed yourself, you have to go down to the supermarket or to a restaurant, and you have a limited number of choices on the shelf. Check out the choices in the breakfast cereal aisle, for example, and you'll see you have the same old crap that's repackaged in various guises and lies, but it essentially comes from one of the 5 monopoly food producers in the United States. So it essentially puts you in a zero-sum game with General Mills or Kellogg's, for example. What's important for holding capitalism together is that the consumer doesn't have an unlimited variety and they don't have the choice of defection. So you have to essentially go down and buy your cereal in the supermarket. You can't really defect from that range of choices that they give you and say go out into the forest to pick your own grape nuts. That kind of option would put you in a payoff matrix without saddle points, without an equilibrium. And Big Agri doesn't like that, because that would mean they would lose control. They would lose control of their profits and they would lose control of your life. The capitalist system is all about control. especially ensuring that those that have the most capital control the game. Before the alien cortex locked up the food and limited our options, we existed in the wild in a game without equilibriums. I would argue that most systems in nature do not have equilibrium or saddle points. In a game of cheetah versus gazelle, for example, the gazelle has to zigzag unpredictably and without bias, just like a bomber or merchant ship in World War II. Such games without equilibrium points have payoff matrices in the same form as rock, paper, scissors or Rochambeau.
One player will do this for $50,000 and a place in history.
Engage. McGill opens with a sharp scissors to take the first lead. This is rock, paper, scissors for the ages, and McGill shoots rock to take the first set.
You can see on this payoff matrix that there's no saddle point or equilibrium point. There's no option that coincides with the least worst outcome for both players. And notice now that, unlike in the previous matrix, that if either player knows in advance what the other player will do, they can always beat them. So each player has to play a random or mixed strategy. And just like the anti-aircraft gunners and pilots or gazelles, if either can find a bias in their opponent's play, they can exploit it and win. Otherwise, the outcome is just up to chance. And that's not a game capitalists want to play, especially not with peasants like you and me. I spent many years in America doing business, and I'd often find myself waiting on conference calls. And while we were waiting for the other participants to arrive, my moment of dread was something that would inevitably come up. It was usually a sales guy would say, just to fill in the time, "Did anybody catch the game last night?" What filled me with so much dread was I can't imagine anything more boring, excruciating like root canal therapy than discussing anything as pointless as team sports. To me, it really doesn't matter who won last year, if the Patriots won the year before. It's just an endless sequence of events that are entirely uncorrelated and entirely pointless. To me, it's so pointless. You might as well assign yourself to the heads team or the tails team and then get all excited about flipping a coin and get morose when tails came up when you were on the heads team and vice versa. It just seems the most inane and pointless practice that I could possibly imagine. In that respect, it's very, very like Rochambeau. The important thing about Rochambeau and these other team sports that are an endless sequence, a continuing sequence of matches, is that the winner is actually arbitrary. It depends entirely on the neocortex frame. All through this series, I've been warning you about neocortex frames and how dangerous they are. Let me show you what I mean by looking at this random sequence of results from a Rochambeau game, and you'll see that it's really a shell game. Who the winner or loser is just depends on how you divide it up into sets or frames, and that's exactly what your alien cortex does. Winning or losing, in this case, is all in the mind. So this is the results of two players, player A and player B, playing rock, paper, scissors. There are a total of 54 rounds, and each player plays randomly. So player A starts by playing scissors, player B responds with paper, which means that in the first frame, if there's only one frame, then player A wins. Next, player A plays paper. Player B plays scissors, which means that player B wins. But have a look what happens now if it's a two-frame game. Then those two rounds turn out to be a draw. In the next round, player A plays scissors, player B plays rock, and that means player B wins. So if it's a three-frame set, then player B is the winner. And it continues so that player A plays rock, player B plays scissors, and player A would win, except if it's in two frames, that would mean there are two draws. And it continues in this way. So if you had one frame only, then the results would actually wind up being player A wins. But if you just make it 2 rounds per frame, then player B wins. If you have 3 rounds per frame, then in this case, the very same plays result in a win for player A. And so it goes on. 6 frames give a win for player B, 9 frames for player A, and so on up to 27 frames, which means that A would be the winner. But this is entirely the same sequence. It's just how you divide it up into frames. Albert A. Bartlett once said, "The greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. But I think the greatest shortcoming of our race is our inability to see the alien cortex and to realize the dangers of the way it perceives everything in limited perceptual frames. Those Procrustean frames of reference that so delude us and will ultimately kill us off." And the same applies to countries. If you have a look at wars, they're just an endless series of battles without any winner. Today's ally is tomorrow's foe, and it goes round and round, resembling something like a game of Rochambeau. Over time, there are no genuine winners or losers. It's just how you frame it. Why lose your privates on the beaches at Normandy, when you could just wait a few years and then Germany would suddenly be an ally again? And a few years more and the president, who was once a soldier fighting the Germans, will be standing in the German capital, Berlin, saying he's a jelly donut.
I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
It's not really a Game of Thrones so much as a game of frames, alien cortex frames. Before we leave the Macy Foundation and the Ratio Club, I want to mention one more thing about the cyberneticists. They became really obsessed with circularity and feedback. Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, demonstrated to some of the cyberneticists a rat that could really solve maze problems, basically just like a real lab rat doing intelligence tests and trying to basically find its way out of a maze. Then Claude Shannon's rat, mechanical rat, did the same thing, in other words, mimicking basic intelligence. Claude Shannon called it Theseus because of the ancient Greek mythology where Theseus escaped from the labyrinth. The rat would learn and memorize the maze and try to negotiate it better and better.
I'm Claude Shannon, a mathematician here at the Bell Telephone Laboratories. This is Theseus. Theseus is an electrically controlled mouse. He has the ability to solve a certain class of problems by trial and error means and then remember the solution. In other words, he can learn from experience. His objective is the goal here in the corner. He is now exploring the maze using a rather involved strategy of trial and error. And we have placed the brain cells, if you like, of Theseus behind the mirror here. This is a bank of relays, telephone relays. We can use these telephone relays to build computing machines. Machines that can solve mathematical problems in a few minutes that would otherwise take many days to solve. We at Bell Labs also use this knowledge to build gun director equipment for the armed forces. The many factors which affect the aiming of guns and guided missiles are computed and applied by these machines in fractions of a second.
So one of the strange things that Claude Shannon found about Theseus the rat is that sometimes it would get stuck in a loop. It would get into this pattern and be unable to break out of it and just carry on perpetually going round and round on a certain track. As soon as members of the Macy Foundation saw this, particularly the psychiatrists and psychologists, because it was quite a mixed bunch, they immediately latched onto the fact that Claude Shannon had discovered a neurosis. He'd actually mimicked for the first time a neurosis in a machine. Much more than a cycle of violence, I normally think of team sports and wars as some kind of endless spy versus spy neuroses that our species has. It comes from your alien cortex behaving exactly like Shannon's rat. Another area of interest for the cyberneticists was the origins of life and the origins of order, particularly Heinz von Foerster. But John von Neumann also did some of the first experimentation with cellular automata. In Conway's Game of Life, each cell has 8 neighbors. There are a few simple rules involved. If a cell has exactly 3 live neighbors, it becomes alive. If a cell has 2 or 3 alive neighbors, it stays alive. Otherwise, it dies. From these few simple rules, amazing patterns arise that seem to be reminiscent of organic life. And it's been shown that Conway's game of life has the properties of a universal Turing machine, which means that it's possible to implement the game of life in the game of life itself. If the game of life can be repeated in the game of life, then it can be repeated ad infinitum. Such recursion would have fascinated the cyberneticists with their fascination for circularity and feedback. I think most computer programmers think that cellular automata were invented by Conway because they're familiar with Conway's game of life. But it was actually John von Neumann that started to implement cellular automata as working really universal Turing machines, as computers. But the aim was to try and mimic life and to try and figure out the secrets of life. Viewing life as really a complex emergent thing that started off really from small cells that are responding to simple rules was very attractive and reductionist idea. Von Neumann started off in 3 dimensions. He loved toys, so he went out and bought the biggest Tinker Toy set that he could and started to work out the rules of how some simple mathematical system could replicate itself. But it didn't really work very well. It was only when Stanislav Ulam pointed out that the whole thing could be done in 2 dimensions on a grid that things started to work a bit better. I can't help pointing out that the grid, as I mentioned in previous videos, is really the alien cortex's signature, and the mere fact that cellular automata require a regular repeating grid structure and a geometric structure, not only the favorite structure of the alien cortex, says something about where this is all going.
Life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, not as we know it. It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it.
For example, if you take an irregular structure, say for example a Penrose tiling, then suddenly it doesn't quite work out the same. If you implemented cellular automata on something like a Penrose tiling, you'd find that it's heavily dependent on the cell you start with. You can't get the same features and patterns to emerge from an algorithm starting on just any square like you can on a grid. So there's something to do with the periodicity of a grid that makes cellular automata possible. It's really reminiscence of Kronos again and the clock.
General, you are listening to a machine. Do the world a favor and don't act like one. Did you ever play tic-tac-toe?
No.
Why?
Because it's a boring game. It's always a tie.
Exactly. There's no way to win. The game itself is pointless. But back at the war room, they believe you can win a nuclear war.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
You never really see adults playing tic-tac-toe or noughts and crosses. That's because as a kid you normally discover that if both players play their best play, it winds up in a draw. In other words, it's a futile game. It's not worth playing.
Except that I never could get Joshua to learn the most important lesson.
What's that?
Futility. That there's a time when you should just give up.
Personally, I loathe board games. To me, most of them seem to be either based on chance or otherwise the solved games are like tic-tac-toe. They wind up in a draw with perfect play, and the only way to actually get a win is if the other player does an imperfect play. And whether the other player is imperfect or not is also by chance. So I don't really see where the skill and the win comes in. It seems to me a kind of neuroses. Our alien cortex, or left brain, seems to be in pursuit of a God algorithm, a perfect play that leads to a win, even though if all these games were solved, and there are a long list of solved games and semi-solved games like chess and Go, solved games like checkers, for example, that show that if you actually have first mover advantage and perfect play by both players, the best outcome is actually a draw, just like von Neumann found with payoff matrices. So while we think of these kind of strategies and competition as something creative, in the pursuit of the God algorithm, we're really in the pursuit of perfection. The pursuit of the perfect play, because the only way you can actually get a loss is by doing imperfect play. A God algorithm is the pursuit of the optimum move from every state or position that the game could be in. It's really only something that an omniscient being would know, and hence it's called the God algorithm. The kind of omniscient being that we imagine has the Old Testament God, a kind of creator God that knows all. What seems to be happening is our alien cortex, or left brain, is deluding us into a kind of neurosis that is set up in a frame there is a possible strategy for a win, when in most games it's either chance or really it's just basically a futile game, because with the best possible play it automatically winds up in a draw. The only winning strategy is not to play those kind of games.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play. How about a nice game of chess?
What it hints at is that the creator God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, is actually not a creative God. It's a destructive God. I can't help feeling that going back to Gödel's theorem and Turing's result, they kind of hinting that the Old Testament God is not really a creative force. It's really a destructive force. It really represents our alien cortex, our left brain, and it's a kind of neurosis, a competitive neurosis that it's got itself into. Ultimately, all alien cortexes are competing with other alien cortexes, and hence they're really competing with themselves.
6 up.
There's no way you can win that game.
I know that. It doesn't. It hasn't learned. Is there any way to make it play itself?
Yes, number of players 0.
In my view, this kind of competition can only be destructive. It's just suicidal. Take, for example, the global geopolitical situation today. China is busy engaged in a mega infrastructure build that is really a vast project of neocolonialism. And if they go through with this and take it to completion, it almost certainly will be the end of our last hope of surviving as a species. Although they've put in a lot of effort and PR to pretend that they're doing a green initiative, it's actually all greenwash. Underneath all the greenwash and lies, the Chinese government has said that they will only start addressing their greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. If they follow through with that, it's estimated that the global average temperatures will rise to 2.7 degrees, and our last hope of surviving as a species will probably be sunk. But are the Western governments going to do anything about it? Well, yes, they're going to try and beat China. Why? Because they're going to try to compete economically. It's all about competition, and that's what's going to destroy us.
I have a plan. Monsieur! I can walk!
We'll meet again. Don't know where. Don't know when.
In the next episode, I promise to do what I've been saying for a long time now, and that's to start bashing the world's religions directly, starting with the most popular religion in the Western world, Darwinism. In the meantime, if you're a competitive type of person, why not take a break and lend some time to thinking about whether perhaps you might not have a neuroses? the kind of neuroses that made Shannon's rat chase its own tail. Perhaps you're just playing a futile game, something like tic-tac-toe or Rochambeau.
One player will do this for $50,000 and a place in history. One player will do this. One player will do this.
I went to okay, seriously, you guys, can we? Okay.